"You can't do this. My family has farmed this land for generations," Harold Whitaker shouted, his weathered hands trembling as he gripped the property survey. Across his kitchen table, real estate developer Meredith Lane tapped her manicured fingernail on the county rezoning application. "Pinewood Estates already owns the adjacent properties, Mr. Whitaker. Your farm is the final piece we need, and the township board has already preliminarily approved our development plan." But 6 weeks later, when township officials gathered for the final vote, Meredith's confident smile vanished as Professor James Wilson unrolled a yellowed parchment across the council table. This 1779 survey map, discovered in Mr. Whitaker's farmhouse wall, clearly establishes that this property contains protected historical sites from the Revolutionary War, making it immediately subject to the National Historic Preservation Act and exempt from residential development. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rolling hills of Oak Ridge County had once been known for their fertile soil and prosperous family farms. For over 2 centuries, farming families had worked the land, following the ancient rhythms of planting and harvest that defined rural America. The Whitaker farm, with its distinctive red barn and colonial-era farmhouse, had stood as a landmark on Meadow Creek Road for nearly 250 years. Its property lines were still marked by the same fieldstone walls laid by Harold's ancestors during the early days of the nation. In recent years, as agricultural profits dwindled and suburban developments expanded outward from the nearest city, many family farms had surrendered to economic pressures. Land once valued solely for its fertility suddenly became prized for housing developments that promised wealth beyond what farming could provide in today's economy. The rural character of Oak Ridge County was changing rapidly, with new subdivisions replacing cornfields and shopping centers appearing where dairy cows once grazed. Harold Whitaker, 72, was the 8th generation to work this stretch of land. His ancestor, Josiah Whitaker, had established the farm in 1774, building the sturdy farmhouse using timber harvested from the property itself. Family stories told how Josiah had been a friend of General Washington and how the farm had played some role during the Revolutionary War, though the specific details had faded with time. The Whitaker farm, 180 acres of prime soil, had sustained the family through wars, depressions, and the transformation of American agriculture. Despite growing pressure from developers, Harold maintained the family's traditional farming practices, growing heirloom vegetables and raising heritage livestock breeds sought after by farm-to-table restaurants throughout the region. His daughter, Lisa, had moved to the city for college and never returned to farming life, establishing a career in environmental law instead. Harold's wife, Margaret, had passed 5 years earlier, leaving him alone on the land his family had tended for generations. Meredith Lane had arrived in Oak Ridge County 18 months earlier as Director of Acquisitions for Pinewood Estates, a luxury housing developer with projects throughout the Northeast. At 45, she had established a reputation for efficiently securing prime rural properties and transforming them into upscale communities, catering to wealthy commuters seeking country living with city amenities. With her corporate background and MBA from a prestigious university, she embodied the new vision for rural America, focused on development and profit rather than agricultural production and sustainability. Lane had established her office in the renovated Oak Ridge County Bank building, historically the financial heart of the farming community. This symbolic takeover hadn't gone unnoticed by longtime residents, who watched with growing concern as family farms were converted into subdivisions with names like Harvest Glen and Farmstead Estates, marketing materials featuring images of the very farming lifestyle their construction was eliminating. Harold sat at his kitchen table on a warm spring morning, reviewing a certified letter from Oakridge Township stating that Pinewood Estates had filed paperwork to have his property rezoned from agricultural to residential development. According to the notice, his property had been identified as underutilized agricultural land, suitable for transition to higher value use. The letter stated that while his current farming operation could continue, the Township Planning Commission had preliminarily approved the rezoning request, with a final vote scheduled in 60 days. The letter explained that Pinewood Estates was generously offering to purchase his property at fair market value, though the amount listed was based on agricultural land prices, not the significantly higher development value the rezoning would create. The proposal included a heritage easement, allowing the original farmhouse to remain as a historical centerpiece for the new development, which would be called Whitaker Farms, in recognition of the property's agricultural heritage. But a knock interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, Harold recognized Meredith Lane's luxury SUV in his gravel driveway. With reluctance, he opened the door to find the developer on his porch, dressed in what city people imagined as appropriate farm attire, expensive jeans that had never seen dirt, and riding boots too clean for honest work. "Mr. Whitaker," she began with professional politeness that never reached her eyes, "I thought it might be helpful to discuss our proposal in person." But Harold invited her inside, the generations of rural courtesy overriding his suspicions about the timing of this visit. They settled at the kitchen table, its oak surface worn smooth by 8 generations of Whitaker hands. Lane's leather portfolio looked alien against the weathered wood. "Mr. Whitaker, I'll be direct," Lane began. "Oakridge County is changing. The economics of small-scale farming can't compete with the housing demand from the city. Pinewood Estates has already acquired over 800 acres surrounding your property for our new planned community. This farm has been in my family since before the Revolution," Harold replied firmly. "Nobody has ever suggested it should become anything other than a farm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. That's because the economic realities were different until recently," Lane explained with practiced patience. "The proximity to the highway and the views from your hillside make this property particularly valuable for our development plans. We're prepared to be generous." Lane slid a document across the table. "Pinewood Estates is offering $2 million for your property. That's significantly above current agricultural land values." Harold glanced at the figure, knowing it was a fraction of what the company would make from dividing his farm into luxury home sites. The amount seemed large only if you ignored the generations of work that had made this land what it was, and the irreplaceable nature of prime agricultural soil that had taken centuries to develop. "I need time to consider this," he said carefully. "Of course," Lane replied, "but I should mention that our rezoning application is already proceeding through township approvals. The Planning Commission vote is scheduled for next month, with the Township Board's final decision to follow." She paused deliberately. "I've also become aware that your property tax reassessment is coming up. If the rezoning is approved, your taxes will increase substantially based on the new potential use value, even if you choose not to sell." Harold stared hard at Lane. "Are you telling me I'll be taxed out of my farm if I don't sell to you?" Lane smiled thinly. "Not at all. I'm simply noting that the economic realities of land ownership in developing areas involve multiple factors. Tax policies tend to reflect highest potential use, not current use." The implication was clear. Lane had leverage beyond the rezoning request and was prepared to use it. The property tax increase would make continuing to farm economically impossible, forcing a sale regardless of Harold's wishes. In fact, she continued. "You might find your retirement years considerably more comfortable if we reach an amicable agreement quickly. Pinewood Estates is prepared to offer a lifetime occupancy arrangement for the original farmhouse, allowing you to remain on a portion of the property." "I'll need to think about this," Harold said, containing his anger with effort. After Lane left, Harold remained at the kitchen table, the offer before him representing a fraction of his farm's true value to him, and potentially the end of his family's multi-generational connection to this land. The veiled threat about property. Taxes revealed how thoroughly Pinewood had researched the vulnerabilities of holdout landowners. What Harold couldn't know was that Lane's visit hadn't been merely informational. Earlier that day, she had met with township officials to accelerate approval for infrastructure assessments and preliminary surveys, creating facts on the ground that would make resistance more difficult. She had also commissioned a historical review of the property's deed chain, looking for any potential complications in the title that might delay development. What neither of them realized was that the colonial-era farmhouse contained historical significance that would dramatically alter the balance of power in their confrontation. Evidence hidden within its walls that no one had recognized in nearly 250 years. The morning after Lane's visit, Harold rose at dawn as farmers have done for generations. Instead of immediately tending to his morning chores, he found himself drawn to the old farmhouse's study. Standing in the room where 8 generations of Whitakers had kept their farm records, he studied the structure with new eyes, not just as the familiar building he'd known his entire life, but as something that might soon be surrounded by construction equipment and McMansions. The Whitaker farmhouse had always been unusual compared to others in the county. Its sturdy post and beam construction, the hand-hewn beams, and the curious carvings on certain door lintels had become so familiar to Harold that he rarely noticed these distinctive features anymore. Now, with Pinewood's threat hanging over him, these details seemed like clues to something he had never fully understood. "Dad always said Josiah built this place to last centuries," Harold murmured to himself, running a hand along one of the smooth beam joints. Josiah had established the farm after returning from service in the early conflicts of the Revolutionary War, insisting on construction methods that incorporated both practical building techniques and symbolic elements that were already becoming rare at that time. As Harold fed his livestock, his mind kept returning to his ancestors' unusual design choices. Why had he insisted on certain dimensions when simpler options would have sufficed? Why position the house at this precise angle on the property? Why incorporate the strange symbols that locals had always assumed were merely decorative carpenter's marks? Later that morning, Harold called the one person who might shed light on his situation. Professor James Wilson had been a history professor at the State University and County Historical Society consultant for nearly 30 years. At 68, he had dedicated his career to documenting the often overlooked history of the region during the Revolutionary War period, with particular focus on the role of farms and rural communities in supporting the Continental Army. "Rezoning challenges, eh?" Wilson said when Harold explained the situation. "I've seen this happening all across the county. These developers have teams of researchers digging through property records looking for the fastest path to conversion." "She's offering enough to set me up for retirement," Harold admitted. "But once I allow development, the land will never be farmland again. 8 generations ended with me." "The timing is suspicious," Wilson noted. "Have you looked into whether there might be historical significance to the property that could affect development plans? The Historical Preservation Commission can sometimes intervene if there's documented historical value." "Wouldn't know where to start," Harold replied. "Bring me copies of whatever documentation you have about the original house construction. And Harold, check your family records. Your ancestor Josiah kept a journal during the Revolutionary period. There might be something about the property's history that could help. That afternoon, Harold climbed into the farmhouse attic where generations of family documents were stored in old trunks and wooden crates. It took hours of searching through dusty papers before he found a leather-bound journal with Josiah Whitaker, 1772-1779, embossed on the spine. The journal chronicled his ancestors' service during the early Revolutionary War and the construction of the farm buildings in meticulous detail. Most entries focused on practical matters, materials acquisition, construction progress, crop planning, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that caught Harold's attention. Met with General W. again regarding the true purpose of this structure. His instructions must be followed precisely if this enterprise is to succeed. The measurements he provided differ from common practice, but there can be no compromise on this aspect. Harold frowned at the reference to General W. Surely, not General Washington himself? He continued reading, finding more puzzling entries. The documents arrived today from headquarters. The responsibility weighs heavily, but I cannot refuse what history has placed in my hands. Completed the hidden compartment today, while the other workers were at midday meal. Only the general knows its location. Better that way. The journal entries became increasingly cryptic about the farmhouse's purpose. The township officials suspect nothing. They see only a farmer's dwelling, not understanding that its dimensions and positioning align precisely with the points we have identified. The maps we have created must remain hidden until the time is right, if that time ever comes. The journal ended abruptly in 1779 with a final entry. All is secure. The maps rest where they belong, hidden from those who would misunderstand their significance. I have honored my oath to the general and to the cause of liberty. May God grant that what we have hidden never needs to be found, for if it does, our new nation faces grave peril indeed. Harold sat back, dust motes dancing in the attic's dim light. His ancestor had apparently built some kind of hidden compartment within the farmhouse, a compartment containing documents or maps of significance to the Revolutionary War, deliberately concealed from British sympathizers and township officials. The next morning, Harold met Wilson at the university, bringing both the rezoning notification and his ancestor's journal. While Wilson examined the Pinewood documents with growing concern, Harold showed him the journal entries. "Your ancestor built a hidden compartment in that house," Wilson said, looking up from the journal with undisguised excitement. "And he did it in consultation with General Washington himself, who apparently entrusted him with items of military significance. But where? I've been in every corner of that house my entire life." Wilson studied the journal more carefully. General W. almost certainly refers to George Washington. He was known to establish networks of trusted civilians to hide documents and supplies during the war. He turned a page, his expression growing more animated. "Harold, these symbols your ancestor mentions, do they look like this?" He turned his laptop toward him, showing images of carved marks with distinctive patterns. "Yes, those exact patterns are carved into lintels throughout the house. I always thought they were just decorative. They're Continental Army intelligence markers," Wilson explained. "They identified safe houses and supply caches. They're quite rare now. Most were removed after the war to protect those who had helped the revolutionary cause." He turned back to the journal, reading more intently. "According to these entries, your ancestor was entrusted with maps, likely military maps showing British positions or perhaps Continental Army supply routes. Documenting such information was considered treason by the British authorities. Anyone caught with such materials would have faced execution." Wilson turned to the Pinewood documents. "As for this rezoning application, there's something we might use here. If your farmhouse contains authentic Revolutionary War intelligence, Materials, it would qualify for immediate protection under both state and federal historic preservation laws. Could that help stop Pinewood's development plans? Potentially, but first we need to find whatever your ancestor hid in that house. That afternoon, they returned to the Whitaker farm with Dr. Susan Chen, an architectural historian specializing in colonial-era construction. Armed with the journal, measuring equipment, and Dr. Chen's knowledge of Revolutionary War-era hidden compartments, they began a systematic examination of the farmhouse. Your ancestor was using intelligence techniques while disguising them as traditional construction, Dr. Chen said, studying the position of the carved symbols. These aren't just decorative. They're creating a specific pattern that relates to measurements and angles significant to surveyors of that period. For hours, they measured distances between marked lintels, examined floorboards, and tapped walls for hollow spaces. As the afternoon light began to fade, frustration was setting in. The journal mentions the hidden compartment but gives no clear indication of its location, Harold said. We could miss it entirely even if it's right. In front of us, Wilson sat on an old chair, flipping through the journal again. Wait, there's something here. He writes about the keystone revealing itself when the evening star aligns with the eastern gate on the anniversary of Lexington. The Battle of Lexington, Dr. Chen suggested immediately. April 19th, 1775. Many revolutionary sites incorporated. Astronomical alignments, particularly for spaces containing sensitive materials. But that's nearly a year away, Harold said. Pinewood's rezoning vote is scheduled for next month. Dr. Chen studied the farmhouse interior more carefully. The alignment wouldn't be exact today, but it should be close enough to identify the general location. They repositioned themselves, studying how light entered through the east-facing windows and where the beams fell on the interior walls. Dr. Chen made calculations based on the historical position of Venus, the evening star, relative to the spring equinox. If I'm right about Revolutionary-era concealment techniques, she explained, they would have created a system where Venus would be visible through a specific window and would align with a marker on significant dates. Using string to trace the light paths and extending them based on Dr. Chen's calculations, they identified a spot on the eastern wall of the study where all their projected lines converged. The wall appeared solid, handcrafted wooden panels like the rest of the room's wainscoting. There's nothing here, Harold said, running his hands over the smooth wood surface. Look at the joint patterns, Dr. Chen suggested. Hidden compartments often had release mechanisms that followed geometric patterns consistent with surveying techniques. Wilson examined the decorative molding near the convergence point. These carvings create a sequence. See how they progress from simple to complex. They might indicate an order. Following the sequence suggested by the carvings, Harold pressed specific panels in order. After the fourth press, they heard a faint click, and a section of the wall, about 3 ft wide and 2 ft tall, shifted inward slightly. It's a compartment, Harold whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. Carefully they pulled the disguised door open, revealing a small space built into the wall. Wilson retrieved gloves from his bag, and they cautiously examined the contents. Inside the hidden compartment lay a metal document tube, remarkably well preserved in the dry, sealed space. With extreme care, Wilson extracted it and placed it on the study table. This appears to be authentic Revolutionary War-era document storage, he breathed, examining the tube's craftsmanship. Military dispatches and maps were often stored this way to protect them during transport or concealment. With Harold and Dr. Chen watching intently, Wilson carefully opened the tube. Inside was a rolled parchment, still flexible despite its age. As he gently unrolled it on the table, all three gasped at what they saw. It was a hand-drawn map of extraordinary detail, showing the entire region around what was now Oak Ridge County. But unlike ordinary property maps, This one contained military notations, British encampments, supply routes, artillery positions, and most significantly, a complex network of dotted lines labeled Washington's supply chain that ran directly through the Whitaker property. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chen whispered, studying the map without touching it. "This is a Continental Army intelligence map showing the supply network that sustained Washington's forces during the Revolutionary War. Maps like this were the most closely guarded secrets of the Continental Army. But the map contained something even more significant. Along what was now the southern border of the Whitaker farm, a small star marked a location labeled Continental Congress Treasury Reserve. "Is that what I think it is?" Harold asked, pointing to the marking. Wilson nodded, his expression solemn. "This appears to be a map identifying the location of one of the Continental Congress's emergency gold reserves, funds hidden throughout the colonies to support the revolutionary cause if Philadelphia or other major cities fell to the British. Some of these reserves were never recovered after the war," Dr. Chen added. "Their locations were compartmentalized information. Only Washington and a few trusted officers knew all the locations." Harold stared at the map, trying to process its significance. "You're saying my ancestor was guarding a map to Revolutionary War gold, and it might still be buried on my property?" "Not necessarily gold," Wilson cautioned, "but definitely something of significant value to the Continental Congress, currency, bonds, or supplies. And yes, if it was never recovered, it theoretically could still be there." He carefully examined the map's other markings. "But regardless of whether any physical treasure remains, this map itself is an extraordinary historical document. It contains previously unknown information about Washington's supply network and potentially resolves several historical mysteries about how the Continental Army maintained its logistics during crucial campaigns." Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. "This single document would qualify your property for immediate consideration under the National Historic Preservation Act. The farmhouse would certainly qualify for the National Register of Historic Places, and the supply route running through your property would likely be eligible for designation as a National Historic Trail." "Would that stop Pinewood's development plans?" Harold asked. "It would create significant obstacles," Wilson confirmed. "Federal designation would trigger mandatory historical impact studies before any development could proceed. At minimum, it would delay the process by years. More likely, it would prevent large-scale development entirely." Harold looked again at the map that his ancestor had hidden nearly 250 years ago, preserved through 8 generations of his family without anyone realizing its significance. The farm that had seemed like a burden in recent years, economically challenging and increasingly isolated among new developments, suddenly revealed itself as something far more significant than he had ever imagined. "We need to approach this carefully," Dr. Chen advised as they gathered at Harold's kitchen table that evening. The map was now carefully placed in an archival folder Wilson had retrieved from his office. "What we found isn't just historically interesting. It's a potential game-changer for the entire township's approach to development." Wilson nodded, making notes on proper documentation protocols. "This map represents an extraordinary historical discovery. The Continental Congress Treasury Reserve notation alone would be enough to justify federal protection." Harold stared at the archival folder now, carefully placed on his kitchen table. "Who do we even contact about something like this? I don't want to just call Pinewood and tell them their development plans are in jeopardy. We need a multi-layered approach," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "This involves federal historic preservation, state-level archaeological significance, and local zoning implications. We need to coordinate with the State Historic Preservation Office, the National Park Service, and probably get a specialized historic preservation attorney." "Pinewood's rezoning hearing is scheduled for next month," Harold reminded them. I can contest the rezoning at the public hearing, but they'll just dismiss me as a holdout landowner without concrete opposition grounds." Wilson tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "Catherine Diaz at the State Historic Preservation Office should be our first call. As the regional director, she can initiate an emergency review based on this discovery." Dr. Chen looked up from her notes. "I know Catherine from several preservation projects. I can call her tonight, but she'll need some preliminary documentation before taking action." "What about township records?" Harold asked. "Shouldn't we look for any official record related to the farm's historical role?" "Doubtful it was ever recorded officially," Wilson explained. "During the Revolution, information about supply routes and resource caches was deliberately kept out of local records where British sympathizers might discover it. But the map itself, with Washington's signature and Continental Army markings, establishes its authenticity regardless of township records." They developed a three-pronged strategy. Dr. Chen would contact Catherine Diaz and the State Historic Preservation Office. Wilson would prepare documentation for the National Register of Historic Places application, and Harold would consult with a historic preservation attorney recommended by Wilson. "Don't tell anyone else about the map yet," Dr. Chen cautioned as they concluded their planning. "Pinewood has connections throughout the township government, and the fewer people who know before we secure legal protection, the better." The following morning, Harold was checking fences when he noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked on the county road near his property. Through binoculars, he could see someone with surveying equipment apparently marking boundaries well in advance of any approved rezoning. The premature activity was concerning but not surprising. Pinewood would naturally want to establish as many facts on the ground as possible before any potential obstacles emerged. What Harold didn't know was that at that very moment, Meredith Lane was meeting with township officials to expedite permits for infrastructure assessment and preliminary road planning. The developer had brought detailed architectural renderings showing Whitaker Farms estates, with 85 luxury homes arranged around a central green space where the original farmhouse would stand as a historical centerpiece. "The Whitaker property is the keystone of our entire township revitalization plan," Lane explained to township commissioners. "Our market research indicates unprecedented demand for this type of community, which would generate significant tax revenue for the township." "And the current owner is cooperating?" one commissioner asked. Lane smiled confidently. "We've made a fair offer that I expect will be accepted shortly. Mr. Whitaker understands the economic realities of modern land use." What Lane didn't share was that she had already scheduled construction equipment to be delivered to a staging area just outside Harold's property line the day after the rezoning vote, creating a point of no return, a pressure tactic that had worked effectively in previous negotiations with reluctant landowners. Meanwhile, Catherine Diaz arrived at the Whitaker farm that afternoon, having cleared her schedule after Dr. Chen's urgent call. At 52, she combined formal training in historic preservation with practical experience navigating the complex intersection of development pressures and historical conservation. "I should caution you that we investigate many claims about Revolutionary War connections," she told Harold as they walked toward the farmhouse. "Most turn out to be either family legends or tenuous connections insufficient for National Register designation." Harold nodded in understanding. "I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." He led Catherine and Professor Wilson to the study, carefully demonstrating the hidden mechanism that revealed the concealed compartment. As the preservation officer stepped into the room and saw the map now carefully displayed on an acid-free cloth on the table, her professional reserve visibly faltered. "The Continental Supply Network," she whispered, her voice filled with recognition as she surveyed the meticulously preserved document. For the next 2 hours, Catherine examined the map's contents, handling it with reverence while documenting everything with photographs. She studied the notation about the Continental Congress Treasury Reserve multiple times, occasionally murmuring to herself as she cross-referenced features with a modern topographical map of the area. My grandfather mentioned stories about Washington's messengers using local farms as part of their network, she explained, carefully examining the dotted lines representing supply routes. According to historical accounts, when the British threatened to capture Philadelphia, the Continental Congress dispersed emergency funds to secure locations throughout the colonies. The locations were known only to Washington and a handful of his most trusted officers. She carefully examined the star marking on the map. This notation appears to match descriptions in Washington's correspondence about resource caches. There are historians who have spent entire careers trying to locate documentation of these supply networks. Harold watched her catalogue the discovery, her expression growing increasingly solemn. Can this help stop Pinewood from developing my farm? Catherine nodded emphatically. This isn't merely significant, Mr. Whitaker. It's potentially a landmark discovery for Revolutionary War history. This map explicitly documents a Continental Army supply route and potential treasury cache on property that has remained essentially unchanged since the Revolutionary period. How quickly can you take action? Dr. Chen asked. I'll file emergency protection paperwork today. It should be processed within 48 hours, Catherine replied. Additionally, I'll initiate the process for having this site designated for the National Register of Historic Places. How long would the emergency protection last? Harold asked. Initially 90 days. That would give us time to complete the full historical assessment and pursue permanent protection, Catherine explained. Given what I've seen, I'm confident we can establish that this site is protected under federal historic preservation laws that would supersede any local rezoning efforts. As they carefully returned the map to its protective folder, Catherine's phone rang. Her expression darkened as she listened to the caller. It seems word of a significant Revolutionary War discovery at the Whitaker farm has already reached the township offices, she said after ending the call. Someone there contacted our office asking for information about any historic designation filings. Harold and Wilson exchanged concerned looks. Their window of secrecy was closing faster than anticipated. Lane must have informants throughout the local government, Wilson surmised. If she learns what's here before the protection is formalized. He didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the risk. Lane might accelerate Pinewood's timeline or find ways to challenge the discovery before protections could be put in place. Catherine departed to file the emergency protection paperwork, promising to expedite the process as much as possible. As her car disappeared down the gravel drive, Harold noticed the surveying vehicle had moved closer to his property line, now openly taking measurements of his access road. That evening, Wilson arrived with troubling news. I spoke with my contact at the county recorder's office about searching for any records related to your ancestors' Revolutionary War service. She found something strange. All land records for this township from 1770 to 1790 have been temporarily removed for digitization as of yesterday morning. What does that mean? It means someone at the county is deliberately restricting access to the historical records that might support your case, Wilson explained. They're covering all bases. Lane likely knows we're investigating the property's history. Harold's phone rang, an unknown number. He answered cautiously. Mr. Whitaker, this is Thomas Bradford from the Township Zoning Department, a brisk voice announced. I'm calling to inform you that we've received a request to expedite the rezoning hearing for your property. As the current owner, you have 5 days to file any objections before the accelerated hearing is scheduled. The timeline had been accelerated significantly. After Harold relayed this development to Wilson, they called Dr. Chen, who had been researching preservation precedents. "They're moving faster than expected," Dr. Chen said when told about the accelerated hearing. "Lane must suspect we found something significant and is pushing to create as many administrative hurdles as possible." "Can they legally expedite the rezoning without my consent?" Harold asked. "Normally no, but they can cite economic development priorities as justification," Dr. Chen explained. "It's questionable, but challenging it would take longer than the 5 days we now have." The pressure campaign intensified the following morning when Harold received a revised letter from Pinewood. This one indicated that their survey team would arrive tomorrow rather than next week, accompanied by township officials to ensure access for pre-development environmental assessment. "They're accelerating everything," Wilson observed. "Lane is clearly worried about whatever we might have discovered." Their fears were confirmed when township vehicles appeared at the farm entrance that afternoon. 2 officials emerged, explaining they needed to conduct a preliminary historical assessment prior to the rezoning hearing. "This property has been farmland for nearly 250 years, Harold protested as he accompanied them on their inspection. "We're just following procedure, Mr. Whitaker," the lead official replied, though his uncomfortable expression suggested he understood the timing was suspicious. Harold carefully steered them away from the house, watching anxiously as they took photographs and measurements. To his relief, they showed no particular interest in the study, focusing instead on the barn and outbuildings. As the officials departed, Harold spotted Meredith Lane's Tesla turning into his driveway. The developer had decided to make a personal appearance, likely hoping to capitalize on the mounting pressure. "Harold," she called with forced friendliness as she approached, "I thought we should talk, given the accelerated timeline. Our design team is eager to finalize the site plan." "You moved up the rezoning hearing without consulting me," Harold replied coldly. "And somehow the township is already processing permits for a development that hasn't been approved." Lane's smile remained fixed. "Development timelines are always fluid. As for the permits, that's standard preliminary work for properties under consideration." Her gaze shifted toward the farmhouse. "I understand you've had some visitors lately. Historians and preservation specialists, I'm told, found something interesting in that old house." The direct acknowledgement confirmed their suspicions. Lane had informants monitoring the property and was well aware something significant had been discovered. "Just researching the farm's history," Harold replied neutrally. "My ancestors' construction techniques have drawn some academic interest." "Historical features rarely affect development plans significantly," Lane said dismissively. "At most, they might require some minor documentation before proceeding. Our revised timeline takes any such minor delays into account." "I haven't agreed to your purchase offer," Harold reminded her. Lane's expression hardened. "The rezoning is proceeding regardless, Mr. Whitaker. While we prefer cooperative arrangements, we can and will secure the property one way or another. The survey team will arrive tomorrow to complete their preliminary work." The threat hung in the air between them. Lane clearly believed she still held all the leverage, unaware that Catherine Diaz was already filing for emergency historical protection based on the map's discovery. "I appreciate your directness," Harold replied with careful restraint, "but I'll need to consult with my attorney before allowing anyone access to my house." As Lane departed, her normally confident demeanor showed subtle signs of frustration. The developer had clearly expected Harold to capitulate under the intensified pressure, and his continued resistance suggested something had changed in the equation. What Lane couldn't know was that Catherine Diaz had already submitted her emergency filing with preliminary photographs of the Revolutionary War map. photographs that had caused immediate excitement among both state and federal historic preservation officials responsible for Revolutionary War sites. The race was now on, Lane accelerating Pinewood's timeline, while Harold and his allies worked to secure protection for the historical treasure hidden within the walls of the Whitaker farmhouse. Less than 24 hours remained before Pinewood's survey team would arrive, but the next 12 hours would likely determine whether a 250-year-old map would be honored or if corporate interests would prevail. As dusk settled over the farm, Harold stood alone by the old stone wall his ancestors had built, placing his hand on the cool granite that had marked the property's boundaries since before the United States existed. Tomorrow would bring either the first step toward permanent protection of this historic site or the beginning of a more difficult battle against a powerful developer with seemingly unlimited resources. What Harold didn't yet know was that Wilson and Dr. Chen had made one more critical discovery while researching Josiah Whitaker's background, information that would further strengthen their case, but also escalate the conflict with Pinewood to an entirely new level. The next morning brought unexpected activity to the Whitaker farm. A state historical preservation van arrived first, followed by 2 vehicles with federal government plates. Catherine Diaz emerged from the lead car, accompanied by a distinguished man in a formal suit who carried himself with unmistakable authority. "Mr. Whitaker," Catherine called as Harold approached. "This is Dr. Robert Montgomery from the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program. After reviewing my preliminary filing, he flew in overnight from Washington." Harold shook hands with the federal official who studied him with keen interest. "Josiah Whitaker was your ancestor, correct? His name appears in several Revolutionary War archives as a member of Washington's intelligence network during a time when such service was extraordinarily dangerous." "I never knew that part of his history," Harold admitted. "The family just described him as a patriot who built this farm after the war." Dr. Montgomery nodded. Many such connections were deliberately obscured for the protection of those involved. The political climate during and after the revolution made public knowledge of intelligence activities dangerous, particularly in regions where loyalist sentiment remained strong. A second federal vehicle disgorged 2 more officials who were introduced as representatives from the National Register of Historic Places. Their presence underscored the seriousness with which the federal government was treating the discovery. As the group walked toward the farmhouse, Harold noticed a township sheriff's vehicle parked at his property entrance. Deputy Rivera approached, looking uncomfortable with his assignment. "Mr. Whitaker, I've been instructed to deliver this," he said, handing him an envelope bearing the Pinewood Estates logo. "It's a formal notice that their assessment team will arrive at noon today under the protection of a township access order signed by Commissioner Jenkins this morning. I'm required to inform you that obstruction could result in legal consequences." The timing was deliberate. Pinewood had secured their access order at the earliest possible moment, likely hoping to establish a presence before any competing legal claim could be filed. Wilson took immediate notice of the exchange. The emergency protection order should be signed by Judge Anderson within hours, he assured Harold. Once issued, it would supersede any local access orders. "But if Pinewood's team arrives first," Harold asked. Dr. Montgomery stepped in. "Given the potential significance under the National Historic Preservation Act, we have options for immediate intervention. I've already alerted the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding potential federal jurisdiction." The assembled experts proceeded to the house where Harold revealed the hidden compartment. The federal officials entered the study with careful reverence, their initial professional reserve giving way to evident excitement as they examined the pristine Revolutionary War map. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Montgomery breathed carefully, examining the supply route markings without touching the document. This appears to be a complete mapping of Washington's northern supply chain as it existed in 1778, an invaluable historical record. The National Register officials focused on the Treasury Reserve notation and the map's relationship to the property itself. The fact that this property has maintained its agricultural character and boundaries since the Revolutionary period makes it exceptionally significant, one observed. This isn't just about the document, it's about the preserved landscape that matches the historical record. For the next 2 hours, the experts meticulously documented the map and the hidden compartment, taking photographs and creating detailed documentation without disturbing the fragile historical materials. They used specialized equipment to verify the parchment's age and the authenticity of the markings. And there's no question of the historical significance, Dr. Montgomery declared as they concluded their initial survey. This map represents a unique and irreplaceable historical treasure of the Revolutionary period. Catherine nodded in agreement. Based on what we've documented today, I'll be recommending immediate federal protection under the National Historic Preservation Act. My preliminary assessment is that this property contains historical significance that would qualify for permanent, protected status. As the experts continued their work, Harold's daughter Lisa arrived, having driven in from the city after receiving her father's urgent call. A skilled environmental attorney, she brought a legal perspective that would prove invaluable. "Dad, I found something critical," she reported quietly as they stood on the porch. "Remember how Mom was working on that family genealogy project before she passed? Look at this." She opened her laptop to reveal digitized newspaper clippings from 1897. The headline read, "Local Farmer Exposes Land Fraud Scheme," with a subheadline, "Ezekiel Whitaker Testifies Against National Development Trust." National Development Trust was the predecessor company to Eastern Properties, which eventually became part of Pinewood's corporate family, Lisa explained. "Your great-great-grandfather was the key witness in a federal case against land speculators who were falsifying property claims throughout the county." With mounting excitement, the father and daughter brought this new information to the assembled experts. "I don't think you understand what we've discovered," Lisa said, stepping forward with the newspaper clippings. "This isn't just about historical artifacts, it's about the legitimacy of development claims themselves." She handed the articles to Dr. Montgomery, who scanned them with professional interest. "This suggests a direct connection between current development pressure and a documented land fraud case from the 1890s, the federal attorney observed. "That raises significant questions about chain of title that would need to be resolved before any development could be authorized." Wilson nodded. "The historical evidence we've discovered explicitly shows that this property was part of Washington's strategic supply network, a purpose that would have superseded any later commercial claims on the land." Just then, they heard vehicles approaching. Through the window, they could see the Pinewood survey team arriving, led by Meredith Lane herself. As the group exited their vehicles, Lane spotted the federal cars already parked in the farmyard. Her confident stride faltered momentarily before she composed herself and approached. Harold met her at the edge of the yard, accompanied by Dr. Montgomery and Catherine Diaz. "Mr. Whitaker," Lane began with practiced professionalism, "we have a township access order authorizing our preliminary assessment." She handed him a document with official township letterhead. Before Harold could respond, Dr. Montgomery stepped forward. "Ms. Lane, I'm Dr. Robert Montgomery, National Park Service. I need to inform you that as of 30 minutes ago, this property has been placed under emergency federal protection pending its evaluation for the National Register of Historic Places." He produced an official document bearing the Department of the Interior seal. This federal order temporarily halts any development activity, including surveys or assessments, for a minimum of 90 days, while the historical significance is evaluated. Lane studied the document, her expression darkening. This is highly irregular. Our rezoning application has already been processed by the township. Federal historic preservation statutes supersede local zoning when nationally significant historical resources are identified, Catherine explained, pointing to specific language in the protection order. What historical significance? Lane demanded, clearly caught off guard. This is just an old farmhouse. Lisa stepped forward, her legal training evident in her precise language. The Whitaker farm contains verified Revolutionary War artifacts and documentation directly connected to George Washington's Continental Army supply network, including evidence of a Continental Congress Treasury Reserve. I don't think local officials were apprised of these historical claims before processing your rezoning application, she continued, her tone professionally neutral but firm. Our team includes representatives from the National Park Service, the State Historic Preservation Office, and the National Register of Historic Places, all of whom have now documented the historical significance. Lane's carefully maintained professional facade cracked visibly. These are historical technicalities that have no bearing on modern development needs. The township has already identified this area for residential expansion. Historical preservation and proper documentation of Revolutionary War sites are not technicalities, Ms. Lane. Dr. Montgomery replied coolly. They're matters of national heritage protected by federal law. Whatever the township has or hasn't approved becomes moot when nationally significant historical resources are identified. As the legal confrontation unfolded in his farmyard, Harold felt a strange sense of connection to his ancestor. Josiah Whitaker had carefully hidden this map, not just as a matter of revolutionary security, but as evidence of something worth protecting across generations. Now, nearly 250 years later, that same evidence was protecting the land from those who would transform it without regard for its deeper significance. The survey team began packing their equipment, clearly recognizing that the day's work would not proceed as planned. The township deputy, unwilling to challenge federal authority, returned to his vehicle after confirming the authenticity of the federal order. Lane remained, her expression a mixture of frustration and calculation. "This is a temporary setback," she said to Harold, her voice low and intense. "Pinewood has resources and patience. When the initial excitement fades, the economic argument will prevail as it always does." "I don't think so," Harold replied calmly. "My ancestors stood against the British when they tried to take this land by force. He preserved the truth, knowing it would be needed someday. This isn't just about economics. It's about honoring a legacy that was meant to last through generations." As Lane departed, Lisa and Wilson joined Harold, watching the Pinewood convoy. "Leave the property. The federal protection is just the beginning," Wilson explained. "With the evidence we've discovered, we can pursue permanent designation of this site under multiple preservation statutes. More importantly, we can challenge the very foundation of Pinewood's development plans." "What happens to the map?" Harold asked. "That will be determined through consultation between federal officials and historical preservation experts," Catherine replied, joining them. "But the National Park Service typically works with property owners to ensure historical materials remain accessible while being properly preserved." As the afternoon progressed, additional historical experts arrived, along with preservation specialists from the Smithsonian Institution who had been urgently dispatched to assess the map. The hidden compartment that had kept it secret for generations was now the center of intense but respectful activity, with each detail being carefully documented while the map remained secure in its original location. That evening, As the sun set over the fields his family had farmed for 8 generations, Harold stood beside the old farmhouse that had been part of his family's legacy since before the United States existed. What he had always seen as simply a well-built old house had revealed itself as something far more significant, a physical manifestation of his ancestors' courage and vision. The house, that had been built to protect vital revolutionary secrets, would continue to stand, not just as a family home, but as a protected historical site that bridged the nation's earliest days with its present. The land that had sustained the Whitaker family would remain farmland rather than becoming a suburban development, just as Josiah Whitaker had intended when he established the farm after helping secure American independence more than 2 centuries ago. As darkness fell, Harold noticed Wilson standing alone on the porch, gazing out over the fields that might have become luxury home sites. "Your ancestor understood something that was rare in his time and remains rare in ours," Wilson said as Harold joined him. He saw that true ownership of land isn't about exploitation, it's about stewardship. He honored that principle even when it wasn't convenient or profitable. Harold nodded, feeling the weight of the legacy he had inherited, one far richer and more complex than he had ever realized. The farm, that had almost been transformed by bulldozers, would instead become a place where American history was preserved and honored, the past reaching forward through time to shape the future in unexpected ways. A golden autumn morning found the Whitaker farm transformed. Where the threat of construction equipment had once loomed, now stood educational signs directing visitors to the newly established Whitaker Continental Supply Route historic site. The distinctive farmhouse, rather than being surrounded by suburban homes, had found new purpose as both working farmhouse and educational center. Harold watched from the porch as a small group followed Wilson, who had accepted a part-time position as the site's first historical interpreter. The professor moved with animated enthusiasm as he guided visitors toward the house, his voice carrying across the yard as he explained the significance of the property's boundaries, which precisely match those on the Revolutionary War map. "Third tour group this week," Lisa remarked, joining her father on the porch with coffee mugs for both of them. The article in American History magazine certainly brought attention. Harold nodded. The discovery had indeed captured national interest once the full story became public. What his ancestor had preserved wasn't merely a military map, but evidence of how ordinary farmers had played crucial roles in securing American independence, creating a legacy of courage and foresight that resonated across generations. "Catherine called yesterday," Harold told Lisa. "The federal protection status has been formalized. Pinewood's attorneys tried to challenge it, but the judge ruled that the historical significance is substantial enough to warrant permanent protection." "Josiah Whitaker understood the long game," Lisa observed. "He preserved evidence knowing it might not be needed for generations, but when it was, it would change everything." The transformation of the Whitaker farm had unfolded with remarkable speed once the federal protection order was issued. The Department of the Interior investigation had quickly confirmed the authenticity of the map and its connection to Washington's Revolutionary War supply network. Most significantly, the site had received permanent designation under the National Historic Preservation Act, providing both protection from development and access to preservation grants. The Department of the Interior had also allocated special funding for the proper preservation of the map and hidden compartment, recognizing their unique historical value. The farmhouse itself had undergone careful conservation, preserving its historical structure while creating a small museum space where visitors could learn about the Continental Army's supply network and the role of civilian farmers in supporting the revolutionary cause. The hidden compartment remained exactly as Josiah Whitaker had designed it, now protected with museum-quality conservation methods so visitors could view the space without endangering the preservation of its historical features. A high-quality replica of the map was displayed in the study, while the original remained secure in a specially designed preservation case. As Harold and Lisa watched the tour group enter the farmhouse, Dr. Montgomery pulled up in his car, waving a folder as he approached. "Fresh from the Department of Interior," he announced, handing Harold the folder. "The Secretary has designated the Whitaker Farm as a National Historic Landmark, effective immediately." Harold opened it to find the official certification, a detailed historical assessment spanning 30 pages that methodically documented the farm's significance, while affirming both its Revolutionary War connections and the extraordinary nature of finding such a well-preserved intelligence map from Washington's network. "This is the highest level of historical recognition a property can receive," Dr. Montgomery continued, his satisfaction evident. "Fewer than 3,000 sites nationwide have earned this status." The Secretary specifically noted the remarkable foresight of Josiah Whitaker in preserving evidence of the Continental Army's supply network and how it created an unbroken chain of historical continuity spanning more than 2 centuries. What had begun as a desperate fight to save his family farm had evolved into something far more significant. The Whitaker farm was now not just preserved, but revitalized with new purpose that honored both its agricultural heritage and its newly discovered historical significance. "Have you heard anything from Lane lately?" Lisa asked as they reviewed the landmark designation. Harold shook his head. "Not directly. I heard she's been reassigned to Pinewood's corporate office. Apparently, rural acquisitions are now considered too legally complex for their regional teams to handle independently." The aftermath of the Whitaker farm discovery had indeed been costly for Meredith Lane. The federal investigation had revealed improper coordination with township officials, resulting in ethics violations that had damaged her professional reputation. More significantly, the publicity surrounding the attempted development of land with documented Revolutionary War significance had severely tarnished Pinewood's corporate image. Pinewood's regional development project had been quietly scaled back, with optioned properties being returned to agricultural use. Several farmers who had been facing similar pressure tactics had used the Whitaker case as precedent to challenge their own rezoning disputes, creating a ripple effect throughout the county. "The most remarkable thing," Wilson said, joining them, after concluding his tour, "is what we found yesterday while cataloguing your family archives." He handed Harold a brittle envelope, carefully preserved in an archival sleeve. "This letter from 1863 shows that your great-great-grandfather deliberately purchased neighboring properties during the Civil War to preserve the original Revolutionary War supply route boundaries. He wrote about maintaining the sacred trust established by his grandfather, even though he didn't know exactly what was hidden in the house." Harold examined the letter with quiet wonder. Generation after generation, his family had maintained this land without fully understanding its historical significance. Each Whitaker had felt the weight of responsibility without knowing its true source, a commitment to stewardship that transcended simple property ownership. "The educational impact is already spreading," Dr. Montgomery noted, gesturing toward the visitors exploring the property. 3 schools have scheduled field trips for next month, and the State University is developing a research program focused on civilian support networks during the Revolution. Your farm has literally rewritten our understanding of how Washington maintained his supply lines in this region. As they walked toward the barn, where a display about historical agricultural practices was being installed, Catherine Diaz joined them with unexpected news. "You remember the Treasury Reserve notation on the map?" she asked, barely containing her excitement. "The archaeological team found something yesterday using ground-penetrating radar. There appears to be a small underground chamber near the Oak Grove, precisely where the map indicated." Harold's eyes widened. After all this time, could there actually be Revolutionary War artifacts buried on my property? "We won't know until the formal excavation," Catherine cautioned, "but the GPR images show a deliberate stone structure about 4 feet underground. Whatever's there, it's not a natural formation." The possibility that the map might lead to an actual Revolutionary War cache added yet another dimension to the farm's historical significance. The site, that had almost become suburban homes, might contain physical connections to the nation's founding struggle. Artifacts preserved underground for nearly 2.5 centuries. The discovery had transformed Harold's relationship with his own heritage. The farm that had sometimes felt like a burden, economically challenging and increasingly isolated amid development, had revealed itself as an irreplaceable historical treasure. His ancestors hadn't merely been farmers, they had been guardians of a legacy that stretched back to the nation's founding. 3 months after the initial discovery of the map, the Whitaker farm hosted an official dedication ceremony for the National Historic Landmark status. Government officials, historians, and community members gathered to commemorate both the historical discovery and the preservation of the working farm that had maintained its Revolutionary-era boundaries. Dr. Montgomery represented the Department of Interior, formally presenting the National Historic Landmark plaque. "What makes this site truly extraordinary," he told the assembled crowd, "is not just the Revolutionary War map preserved here, but the story of generational stewardship it represents. 8 generations of the Whitaker family maintained this farm's boundaries and structure without knowing what it contained. Yet their care ensured this irreplaceable historical treasure survived intact until it could be properly recognized and shared." As part of the ceremony, Harold and Wilson together unveiled a new interpretive sign beside the farmhouse entrance. It bore an inscription reading, "Established by Josiah Whitaker in 1774 to support the American Revolution, preserved by his descendants for 250 years. May this site continue to teach us that true citizenship requires both courage in the moment and vision for the future." The farm that had nearly been transformed by suburban development had found new purpose that honored both its agricultural traditions and its unexpected historical significance. The farmhouse that had silently guarded its secrets for centuries would continue standing, not as a historical centerpiece surrounded by luxury homes, but as a bridge between America's revolutionary past and its present. As the ceremony concluded and guests mingled on the farmyard that had hosted 8 generations of Whitakers, Harold found himself standing beside the hidden compartment where his ancestor had concealed the map. He placed his hand on the weathered wood paneling, feeling a profound connection across time. "You built better than anyone knew, Great-Grandpa Josiah," he murmured. "Your promise kept ours." The Whitaker farm would continue, not just as a working agricultural operation or historical site, but as living testimony to the power of keeping promises and the unexpected ways the past can reach forward to protect the future. The 250-year-old mystery had finally found its resolution, and in doing so had ensured that both the historical heritage it protected and the land that sheltered it would endure for generations to come. Yet the story of the Whitaker farm was just beginning to reveal its full significance. The archaeological investigation of the potential Treasury Reserve site had proceeded with meticulous care, with each layer of soil carefully sifted and documented. 3 weeks after the dedication ceremony, Harold received an urgent call from the lead archaeologist. "Mr. Whitaker, we've reached the stone chamber," Dr. Eliza Martinez reported, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "We need you here, immediately." When Harold arrived at the excavation site, he found a team of archaeologists gathered around a small opening in the ground, their expressions a mixture of professional focus and barely contained wonder. "We've opened the chamber," Dr. Martinez explained, leading him to the edge. "It's intact, completely sealed since the Revolutionary period." With proper safety equipment, Harold descended the temporary stairs into the excavation. The archaeologists had uncovered a small chamber about 8 feet square, constructed of fitted stone with a carefully crafted ceiling. The space had remained remarkably dry due to the innovative drainage system Josiah Whitaker had designed around it. In the center of the chamber stood a small, iron-bound chest, its surface showing the inevitable effects of centuries underground, but still intact. Around it lay several wooden crates with Continental Army markings, their contents not yet examined. "We haven't opened anything," Dr. Martinez explained. "We needed proper conservation specialists present, and frankly, we wanted you here as the property owner when we discover what your ancestor was guarding all these years." Within hours, a specialized team from the Smithsonian arrived to oversee the proper handling of whatever Revolutionary-era materials might be contained in the underground chamber. With Harold, Wilson, and Dr. Montgomery watching, they carefully began the preservation and documentation process. The wooden crates contained what the conservation specialist identified as medical supplies. Early surgical tools, medicinal herbs preserved in remarkable condition, and what appeared to be field dressings. These would have been critical for Washington's army, the specialist explained. Medical supplies were among the most difficult to obtain during the Revolution. The iron-bound chest, however, contained something far more significant. As the conservators carefully opened it, using techniques to prevent damage from sudden exposure to air, they revealed stacks of paper currency issued by the Continental Congress, along with handwritten ledgers documenting supply purchases throughout the region. "This is extraordinary," whispered the lead conservator. "These are Continental dollars, the currency issued to finance the Revolution. Most were destroyed or lost when they became worthless after the war. A collection this size, preserved in this condition, is unprecedented." But beneath the currency lay something even more remarkable, a leather portfolio bearing George Washington's wax seal. Inside was a handwritten letter from Washington himself to Josiah Whitaker, "To Captain Josiah Whitaker, whose loyalty and service have been beyond reproach. I entrust to your protection these emergency funds and supplies to be maintained in secrecy until such time as they may be called for in our nation's defense. Should Providence favor our cause such that these resources are never required, they shall stand as testament to the sacrifices made by ordinary citizens in extraordinary times. Your farm shall remain marked in our confidential records as a place where liberty found safe harbor in its darkest hour. With the deepest gratitude for your service to our cause, I remain your humble servant, G. Washington." Harold stared at the letter, written in Washington's own hand and preserved in near-perfect condition within the sealed chamber. The document established beyond any doubt that his ancestor hadn't merely been a sympathizer to the revolutionary cause. He had been a captain in Washington's intelligence network, entrusted with safeguarding critical resources. "This changes our understanding of how Washington maintained reserve supplies," Dr. Montgomery said, carefully examining the letter through its protective covering. "Historians have long speculated about his emergency cash system, but this is the first intact site ever discovered." The archaeological find transformed the Whitaker farm from an important historical site to a historical discovery of national significance. News of the underground chamber and its contents spread quickly through academic circles and soon reached the national media. Within days, the quiet farm that had almost become suburban housing became the focus of documentary filmmakers, historical researchers, and educational organizations. 6 months after the discovery of the map that had saved his farm from development, Harold found himself in a position he never could have imagined. The Whitaker farm had been incorporated into a newly established Revolutionary War heritage trail, linking sites across the state that told the story of the war beyond the famous battlefields. The National Park Service had partnered with the Whitaker family to establish an educational center in the renovated barn, where visitors could learn about the civilian support networks that had sustained Washington's army. Most significantly, the discovery had prompted a broader historical reassessment of how ordinary farms and rural communities had contributed to American independence. Historians who had previously focused primarily on military campaigns and political developments began exploring the critical role of civilian supply networks and intelligence operations based in rural communities. "Your farm has literally changed how we teach the Revolutionary War," Wilson told Harold as they walked the property one crisp autumn day. "Students who once memorized battle dates are now learning about the complex civilian support systems that made those battles possible." For Harold himself, the discoveries had resolved a question that had troubled him since Margaret's passing. What would happen to the farm after him? With Lisa established in her urban legal career and no obvious successor to continue the agricultural tradition. The answer had come unexpectedly from Lisa herself, who had taken a leave of absence from her law firm to help manage the farm's transition to its new role. Inspired by the historical discoveries and the public response to them, she had found a new passion in the intersection of agricultural heritage and historical preservation. "I'm not coming back to the firm," she told her father one evening as they sat on the porch. "I've accepted a position with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, focusing on agricultural properties with historical significance. I'll be based here, working remotely when I'm not traveling." "You're coming home?" Harold asked, barely concealing his emotion. Lisa nodded. "Not to farm conventionally, that's still your domain, but to help develop this place as a model for how historical farms can remain working agricultural operations while sharing their broader significance. The Trust wants to use the Whitaker farm as a case study in sustainable historical preservation." This unexpected resolution brought Harold a peace he hadn't felt in years. The farm wouldn't be abandoned or sold after him. It would continue evolving while maintaining its essential character and historical significance. The underground chamber, carefully excavated and preserved, had been transformed into an accessible educational exhibit, protected by a specially designed structure that preserved the original stonework, while allowing visitors to view the space where Washington's emergency supplies had remained hidden for nearly 250 years. The contents themselves, after proper conservation, were displayed in a purpose-built gallery in the farmhouse, where climate-controlled cases protected the fragile materials while making them accessible to researchers and visitors. The Continental currency, having no modern monetary value but immense historical significance, had been documented by the Smithsonian and returned to display at the farm. Washington's letter, however, was so historically significant that a compromise had been reached. The original would rotate between the Whitaker farm, the Smithsonian, and Mount Vernon, with a high-quality replica always on display at the farm when the original was elsewhere. Most remarkably, the historical assessment had revealed additional layers of the farm's significance that even Harold hadn't known. Archival research prompted by the initial discoveries had uncovered evidence that the Whitaker farm had served as a station on the Underground Railroad during the 1850s, with Josiah's grandson continuing the family tradition of standing for liberty by helping escaped slaves travel northward to freedom. "Your family didn't just help create America," Wilson remarked when this connection was confirmed. "They helped it live up to its ideals across multiple generations." The revelation about the Underground Railroad connection had inspired a new, Research initiative, with historians and archaeologists carefully examining the property for evidence of this chapter in its history. Lisa had embraced this dimension of the farm's legacy with particular passion, seeing it as a continuation of the commitment to liberty that had begun with Josiah's service to Washington. 1 year to the day after Harold had opened the hidden compartment and discovered the map that changed everything, he stood in the field where archaeologists continued their careful work. The original discovery had led to a series of others, each revealing a new dimension of the farm's historical significance. The land that had seemed like a simple agricultural property, increasingly isolated amid suburban development, had revealed itself as a living historical document spanning the entirety of American history. "Your ancestor built this farm as more than just a place to grow crops," Dr. Montgomery said, joining Harold by the excavation site. "He created a living testament to the principles he fought for, a physical embodiment of the liberty he helped secure. Each generation of your family continued that work, often without fully understanding the legacy they were preserving." Harold nodded, watching as a school group toured the property, their young faces alive with curiosity, as Wilson explained how the farm had functioned during the Revolutionary period. The connection between past and present was palpable here, not as a static museum piece, but as a living continuum of American experience. "Josiah knew that securing independence was just the beginning," Harold replied, thinking of the letter they had found. He understood that the principles of the Revolution would need to be preserved and renewed by every generation that followed. The irony wasn't lost on Harold, that Pinewood Estates had unwittingly triggered a chain of events that had not only saved his farm, but transformed it into something far more significant than it had been before. The development threat had led directly to the discovery that revealed the property's true importance, not just to the Whitaker family, but to the nation's understanding of its own origins. Meredith Lane had made an unexpected reappearance 6 months after the initial discovery, arriving unannounced one afternoon as Harold was finishing his chores. Her corporate polish remained, but her demeanor had shifted noticeably. "Quite a transformation," she had observed, gesturing toward the new educational center and the carefully preserved archaeological sites. "Not what I had envisioned for this property, but impressive nonetheless." "Not what either of us expected a year ago," Harold had acknowledged, studying the woman who had nearly succeeded in transforming his family's legacy into a housing development. Lane had nodded, surprising Harold with a moment of candor. "I miscalculated, not just the legal situation, but the community response. It's changed my entire perspective on rural development." "How so?" Harold had asked, genuinely curious. "I've left Pinewood," Lane had explained. "I've started a consulting firm helping communities develop preservation-based economic strategies as alternatives to conventional development. Turns out there's more sustainable value in preserving authentic places than in replacing them." There had been no direct apology in her words, but Harold had detected something like respect, perhaps even a reluctant acknowledgement that the values he had defended had proven to have substance and worth beyond sentiment. Now, as Harold walked his property with Lisa and Wilson, planning the next phase of the farm's evolution, he reflected on how completely his relationship with the land had transformed in just 1 year. What had once felt like a burden, an economically challenging operation increasingly out of step with the surrounding development, had revealed itself as an irreplaceable treasure, not just for his family, but for the nation's understanding of its own history. "We've had 3 more farmers reach out about potential historical assessments of their properties," Lisa reported as they walked. "The Whitaker discovery has inspired others to look more closely at their family histories and property records." The ripple effect continued to spread. What had begun as one farmer's stand against a developer had evolved into a regional reassessment of rural heritage and historical preservation. The township that had once eagerly pursued residential development had established new guidelines for historical assessment before rezoning agricultural properties, and other communities were following suit. The archaeological investigation had expanded beyond the original underground chamber to include a systematic assessment of the entire property. Ground-penetrating radar had identified several additional areas of interest, suggesting that the farm's historical significance might extend beyond even what they had already discovered. "This place keeps revealing new layers of its story," Wilson observed, as they passed a team of university students carefully excavating near the old stone wall. Each generation left their mark, often hidden from view, but preserved in the landscape itself. For Harold, now 73, the transformation had brought an unexpected gift, the certainty that what his family had built over 8 generations would continue beyond him. The Whitaker Farm Legacy Trust, established with support from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, would ensure that the property remained both a working farm and an educational resource in perpetuity. Lisa had taken the lead in developing the farm's educational programs, partnering with schools and universities to create immersive historical experiences. The Whitaker Farm Institute for Agricultural Heritage, funded through a combination of grants and visitor revenues, now offered programs connecting sustainable farming practices with historical agricultural traditions. "Dad, you remember how worried you were about the farm's future before all this happened?" Lisa asked as they reached the ridge overlooking the property. "Now it's not just preserved, it's thriving in ways we never imagined." Below them, the farm that 8 generations of Whitakers had tended spread out in the golden afternoon light. The fields still produced crops, though now some were planted with the heritage varieties Josiah would have recognized. The farmhouse and barn stood as they had for centuries, their historical integrity preserved while their purpose evolved. But now the property was more than a farm. It was a living classroom where thousands of visitors each year connected with the story of America's founding in tangible personal ways. The map that Harold had discovered had not only saved the farm from development, it had revealed its true purpose as a keeper of American memory. The Whitaker farm was hosting its anniversary celebration, exactly 2 years since the discovery of the Revolutionary War map that had transformed the property from an endangered family farm to a nationally recognized historical treasure. The event had drawn visitors from across the country, including historians, preservationists, and families simply seeking to connect with America's rural heritage. Harold stood at the podium erected on the farmhouse lawn, looking out at the gathered crowd with a sense of wonder at how completely his life had changed in just 24 months. "When I found that hidden compartment in my family's farmhouse," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive audience, "I was simply trying to save my land from development. What I discovered instead was my family's place in the American story, a legacy of courage and foresight that had been preserved in these walls for nearly 250 years. He gestured toward the farmhouse behind him, its weathered clapboards and hand-hewn beams, now recognized as one of the most historically significant residential structures from the Revolutionary period, still standing on its original site. Josiah Whitaker built this house to shelter both his family and the secrets that could help secure American liberty. Later generations maintained it without fully understanding what they were protecting. Today, it stands not just as my family's home, but as a place where all Americans can connect with the ordinary farmers who did extraordinary things to build our nation. The transformation of the Whitaker farm had exceeded everyone's expectations. What began as an emergency effort To halt a development project had evolved into a comprehensive historical research initiative that continued to yield new discoveries. The property now functioned as a working historical farm, educational center, and archaeological research site, a living laboratory where the past informed the present. As Harold concluded his remarks, he introduced the day's keynote speaker, Dr. Eliza Martinez, who had led the archaeological team that discovered the underground chamber containing Washington's emergency supplies. 2 years ago, I received a call about a map found in a farmhouse wall, Dr. Martinez began, addressing the rapt audience. I expected to find perhaps a minor historical footnote. Instead, we uncovered a site that has fundamentally changed our understanding of the Continental Army's logistical operations during the Revolutionary War. She clicked to a slide, showing the original map beside modern archaeological imaging of the property. The Whitaker farm has become the most extensively documented civilian support site from the Revolutionary period, revealing how Washington's army relied on networks of ordinary farmers who took extraordinary risks to secure American independence. The archaeological work had continued to yield remarkable discoveries. Beyond the initial underground chamber, researchers had identified and carefully excavated several additional historical features on the property. These included a hidden storage space beneath the barn floor where period weapons had been concealed, and evidence of a sophisticated signal system that allowed the farm to communicate with other revolutionary sites using lanterns placed in specific farmhouse windows. Most significantly, the continued research had uncovered documents suggesting that the Whitaker farm had hosted a secret meeting between Washington and French military advisors in 1777, a gathering intentionally kept out of official records to protect the participating farmers from British reprisals. We've traditionally studied the Revolution through its military campaigns and political declarations, Dr. Martinez explained. The Whitaker farm has helped us understand the vital civilian infrastructure that made victory possible, the ordinary people who risked everything for a cause they believed in. As she concluded her presentation, Dr. Martinez unveiled the newest addition to the site, a detailed, three-dimensional digital reconstruction of the farm as it would have appeared during the Revolutionary period. Using archaeological evidence, period documents and advanced imaging technology, the model allowed visitors to virtually explore the property as Josiah Whitaker would have known it. This isn't just about preserving old buildings, she emphasized. It's about understanding how ordinary places became extraordinary through the courage and commitment of those who lived and worked here. Following the formal presentations, visitors dispersed to explore the property. Some joined guided tours of the archaeological sites. Others participated in demonstrations of 18th-century farming techniques, while families enjoyed the children's area where young visitors could try their hand at decoding Revolutionary War messages using actual cipher techniques from Washington's intelligence network. Harold found himself near the original hidden compartment, now carefully preserved with a protective viewing area that allowed visitors to see exactly how his ancestor had concealed the map that changed everything. Lisa was leading a small group through the space, explaining the ingenious construction techniques that had kept the compartment secret for generations. "My father discovered this hidden space entirely by accident," she told the visitors, "or perhaps not by accident at all, but at precisely the moment when it was needed most, just as the farm was about to be lost to development." As the tour moved on, Lisa joined her father by the viewing area. "2 years ago, I was a city attorney with no connection to agriculture," she mused. "Now I'm leading a national initiative on agricultural heritage preservation. Life takes unexpected turns." Harold nodded, watching as another group of visitors examined the replica of Washington's letter displayed where the original had been found. "Your mother would have loved seeing this," he said quietly. She always believed this farm had stories to tell. The Whitaker Farm Legacy Trust, which Lisa now directed, had grown beyond their initial vision. What began as a means to preserve one historically significant property had evolved into a model for agricultural heritage conservation throughout the region. The trust now advised dozens of historic farms, helping them develop sustainable economic models that preserved their agricultural character while sharing their historical significance. "The Mitchell farm called yesterday," Lisa told her father, as they walked toward the newly established research center housed in the renovated barn. "They've discovered what appears to be a 19th century boundary marker related to the Underground Railroad. They want our team to help document it properly." The Whitaker effect, as preservationists had begun calling it, had rippled through rural communities across the state. Inspired by the discoveries at the Whitaker property, farmers had begun examining their own historical records and family stories, often finding significant historical connections that had been overlooked for generations. These discoveries weren't just academically interesting, they were transforming the economic landscape of rural communities that had been facing development pressure. Properties with documented historical significance qualified for preservation. Grants, tax incentives, and educational partnerships that created sustainable alternatives to selling for development. "It's not just about saving old buildings from bulldozers," Lisa often explained in her presentations to community groups. "It's about recognizing that our agricultural heritage has value beyond the price of the land itself. Cultural value, historical value, educational value. When we understand what we have, we make better decisions about its future." As Harold and Lisa reached the research center, they found Wilson in animated conversation with a group of graduate students. The professor's retirement from the university had lasted precisely 6 months before he accepted a position as the center's director of historical research. At 70, he brought not only academic expertise, but boundless enthusiasm for uncovering the stories embedded in the landscape. "The Continental Congress papers we've been examining confirm it," Wilson told Harold excitedly. "Josiah Whitaker wasn't just hiding supplies. He was one of Washington's primary intelligence coordinators for this entire region. The coded correspondence we've found suggests he managed at least a dozen civilian informants who gathered information on British troop movements." This latest discovery had added yet another dimension to the farm's historical significance. The property that had almost become suburban housing had instead become a key site for understanding the earliest intelligence operations in American history, a physical link to the citizen spies who had risked execution to secure independence. The National Intelligence Museum had recently approached the Trust about establishing a satellite exhibit at the farm, focusing on civilian intelligence networks during the founding period. The proposal would bring additional resources and visitors to the site while further developing its educational mission. As the day's celebration continued, Harold took a moment to walk alone to the ridge overlooking the property. From this vantage point, he could see the entire farm spread below him, fields still in active cultivation, the historic farmhouse and barn now bustling with visitors, the carefully preserved archaeological sites where researchers continued their work. Just beyond his property line stood a stark reminder of what might have been. Pinewood Estates had proceeded with development on neighboring land they had acquired before the Whitaker discoveries. Luxury homes now stood where cornfields had once grown, their architectural designs including superficial colonial elements that mimicked the authentic historical features of the Whitaker farmhouse. The contrast between the preserved farm and the adjacent development threw the significance of what had been saved into sharp relief. The Whitaker property remained an island of authentic historical landscape amid expanding suburban development, a tangible connection to the nation's founding period that could never be replicated once lost. Harold was joined at the ridgetop by Dr. Montgomery, who had traveled from Washington for the anniversary celebration. The National Park Service official had become a friend and ally over the past 2 years, helping navigate the complex world of federal historical designation and preservation funding. "I was just thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't found that map," Dr. Montgomery said, gazing across the property. "All this would be gone, not just the buildings but the archaeological sites, the landscape itself. We wouldn't even know what we had lost." Harold nodded, considering how close they had come to losing everything. "My ancestor hid that map for a purpose, to protect information that was vital to the revolution. I don't think he could have imagined it would save his farm 2.5 centuries later. That's the power of preservation," Montgomery replied. "When we save these places, we're not just protecting old buildings. We're keeping stories alive, maintaining connections across generations. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather's act of courage created a legacy that continues to teach and inspire people today." The educational impact of the Whitaker farm had grown far beyond local significance. School groups from across the country now visited the site, experiencing immersive educational programs that brought revolutionary history to life. University researchers conducted fieldwork on the property, developing new archaeological techniques, specifically adapted to documenting Revolutionary-era farm sites. The Smithsonian had featured the Whitaker discoveries in a major exhibition on civilian contributions to American independence, bringing national attention to the role of ordinary farmers in the revolutionary struggle. Documentary filmmakers had produced a feature on the farm that was now used in classrooms nationwide, helping students understand how historical discovery continues to reshape our understanding of the past. As Harold and Montgomery descended from the ridge, they passed one of the site's most popular features, a demonstration garden where the crops grown during the Revolutionary period were cultivated using 18th century techniques. Here, visitors could literally taste history, sampling varieties of vegetables that Josiah Whitaker would have grown to feed his family and potentially supply Washington's troops. The most powerful educational experiences engage all the senses, Lisa had explained, when developing this feature. When people taste the same foods, touch the same tools, and walk the same paths as those who lived here during the Revolution, they form connections that go beyond facts and dates. This holistic approach to historical interpretation had made the Whitaker farm a model for heritage sites nationwide. Rather than preserving the property as a static museum, the Trust had developed it as a living landscape where visitors could experience the continuing relevance of agricultural heritage and revolutionary history. As the anniversary celebration continued into the evening, the farmyard was transformed for a community dinner featuring foods grown on the property and prepared using both historical and contemporary techniques. Long tables had been set up beneath strands of lights, creating a festive atmosphere where historians mingled with local families and visitors from across the country shared the experience of dining on the historic site. Harold took his place at the head table, joined by Lisa, Wilson, Dr. Martinez, and other key figures who had helped transform the farm from an endangered property to a national treasure. As the meal progressed, he found himself in conversation with Catherine Diaz, whose prompt action 2 years earlier had secured the emergency protection that prevented development. "I visit dozens of historic sites each year in my role," she told him, "but there's something special about the Whitaker farm. Maybe it's because we're seeing history being discovered in real time, or maybe it's the continuity of purpose, the way the land has been maintained by the same family for so many generations. I think it's also the unexpected nature of the discovery," Lisa added, joining their conversation. The fact that something so historically significant was hidden in plain sight reminds us that extraordinary stories can exist in seemingly ordinary places. This theme, the extraordinary within the ordinary, had become central to the educational philosophy developed at the farm. The site's interpretive materials emphasized that the American Revolution wasn't just fought by famous generals and politicians, but sustained by thousands of ordinary farmers who made crucial contributions that often went unrecorded in official histories. That's what makes the Whitaker documentation so valuable, Wilson explained to a visitor at the table. Most civilian contributors to the revolution left few records, often intentionally destroying evidence that might incriminate them if the British prevailed. Finding intact documentation of this civilian support network is like discovering a missing chapter in our national story. As darkness fell, the celebration culminated with a special ceremony at the underground chamber site. Lanterns illuminated the path as visitors gathered around the carefully preserved archaeological feature, now protected by a specialized structure that allowed viewing while ensuring conservation. Harold stood before the assembled group, holding a replica of the iron-bound chest that had contained Washington's letter. 245 years ago, my ancestor buried these supplies as an act of faith in America's future, he said, his voice strong in the evening air. He couldn't know if the revolution would succeed. He risked everything, his farm, his family, his life, for a nation that didn't yet exist. He placed the replica chest at the entrance to the chamber. Today, we're not just celebrating the discovery of historical artifacts. We're honoring the courage of ordinary people who did extraordinary things in service to ideals larger than themselves. Their story reminds us that the grandest movements in history ultimately depend on individual choices made by people who may never see the full fruits of their actions. Lisa joined her father, carrying a leather portfolio similar to the one that had contained Washington's letter. The trust placed in Josiah Whitaker wasn't just about hiding supplies, she added. It was about preserving something for future generations, creating a legacy that would outlast any single lifetime. She opened the portfolio to reveal not a historical document, but a newly created one, the Whitaker Farm Stewardship Covenant, a formal agreement ensuring that the property would remain both a working farm and educational site in perpetuity. Today, we're renewing that commitment to stewardship, she continued. This covenant ensures that the Whitaker farm will never face the threat of development again. It will continue as living testimony to our agricultural heritage and revolutionary history for generations yet to come. Harold signed the document first, followed by representatives from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the State Historical Society, and the Department of the Interior. The formal agreement represented the culmination of 2 years of careful planning to secure the farm's future beyond any single generation or economic cycle. As the signing concluded, the assembled visitors erupted in applause, not just for the ceremonial moment, but for the remarkable journey that had transformed an endangered family farm into a national historical treasure. The property that had almost been lost had instead become a place where America's founding story could be experienced in tangible, meaningful ways. The celebration continued with an evening program at the newly completed amphitheater, where a living history presentation depicted key moments from the farm's revolutionary history. Professional actors portrayed Josiah Whitaker and his family, bringing to life the daily realities and extraordinary risks faced by civilian supporters of the revolution. As Harold watched the performance, he reflected on how completely his relationship with the farm had evolved. What had once felt like a burden, a financially challenging property increasingly isolated amid suburban expansion, had revealed itself as an irreplaceable treasure with significance far beyond his family's personal connection. "Your ancestor buried supplies as an investment in liberty," Dr. Montgomery said, joining Harold as the performance concluded. "You've transformed that investment into an educational legacy that will continue teaching Americans about their heritage for generations to come." The Whitaker Farm Institute had recently expanded its programming to include teacher training workshops, archaeological field schools, and agricultural heritage internships. Each year, thousands of students and educators gained hands-on experience with both historical research techniques and sustainable farming practices, carrying the lessons of the property far beyond its physical boundaries. The most powerful aspect of this site is the continuity, Lisa often explained in her presentations. This isn't just a place where revolutionary history happened. It's a place where that history has been continuously preserved through 8 generations of stewardship, creating an unbroken connection from 1774 to today. This concept of continuity had become central to the site's significance. Unlike reconstructed historical villages or relocated historic buildings, the Whitaker farm represented an authentic, unbroken line of agricultural use and family stewardship, spanning the entire history of the United States, a living timeline embodied in a physical landscape. As the evening's events concluded, visitors departed with a deeper connection to both agricultural heritage and revolutionary history. Many commented on how the experience had transformed their understanding of the founding period, helping them see beyond the familiar names and dates to recognize the crucial role played by ordinary farmers in securing American independence. Harold and Lisa walked back to the farmhouse in comfortable silence, passing the illuminated archaeological sites and educational exhibits that had transformed their property. The house that had sheltered 8 generations of their family now stood at the center of a national historical site, its hidden compartment finally revealed, its secrets shared with the world. "Dad, did you ever imagine any of this when you found that map?" Lisa asked as they reached the porch. Harold shook his head, looking out over the property that had been his family's legacy for nearly 250 years. "I was just trying to save the farm," he said quietly. "I never imagined we'd be saving a piece of American history that no one knew existed." "That's the thing about preservation," Lisa replied. "We often don't know the full value of what we're saving until after we've saved it." The discovery that had begun with a desperate search for leverage against a development project had evolved into something far more significant. A transformation not just of one property, but of how communities throughout the region valued their agricultural heritage and historical landscapes. The Whitaker effect continued to spread as other farmers examined their own historical records and family stories, often finding significant connections that had been overlooked for generations. Properties that might have been sold for development were instead being evaluated for their historical significance, creating new economic models that preserve both agricultural use and cultural heritage. As Harold prepared for bed in the same farmhouse where Josiah Whitaker had hidden the revolutionary map, he reflected on the unexpected journey of the past 2 years. The threat that had seemed like the end of his family's agricultural legacy had instead revealed its true significance, not just as farmland, but as a physical connection to the nation's founding struggle. In the morning, he would rise and tend to the heritage crops growing in fields that had been cultivated continuously since before American independence. School buses would arrive carrying students eager to experience the living history of the site. Researchers would continue their careful work, uncovering new dimensions of the property's significance. The Whitaker farm had been saved not just from bulldozers, but for something, for education, for research, for the tangible connection to history that could only be experienced in authentic places. The map that Harold had discovered had done more than prevent development. It had revealed the true purpose of the land his family had tended for 8 generations. As Josiah Whitaker had written in the journal entry Harold had first discovered 2 years earlier, "I have honored my oath to the general and to the cause of liberty. May God grant that what we have hidden never needs to be found, for if it does, our new nation faces grave peril indeed." The hidden map had finally been found, not in a moment of national peril, but in a time when the connection to revolutionary heritage faced erasure beneath suburban development. In saving the map, Harold had preserved not just his family's farm, but a crucial piece of the American story, a testament to how ordinary farmers doing extraordinary things had helped create a nation that endured for nearly 2.5 centuries. The Whitaker farm would continue this legacy not just as a historical site, but as a working agricultural operation, adapted to contemporary needs while honoring traditional knowledge. The land that had supported 8 generations of one family would now educate countless generations of Americans about their agricultural heritage and revolutionary history. As Harold drifted to sleep in the house his ancestor had built, he felt a profound sense of connection across time, a reassurance that the choices made today could create ripples that would continue long after any single lifetime. The map, hidden by Josiah Whitaker, had waited patiently in its secret compartment until the moment when it was most needed, creating protection that spanned centuries. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new discoveries, and new opportunities to share the continuing story of the Whitaker farm, the ordinary place that had revealed itself as extraordinary. The family land that had become a national treasure, the endangered farm that had transformed into a beacon of historical preservation. For communities throughout the nation, the ancient map had indeed changed everything, revealing that the most valuable treasures aren't always gold or silver, but the stories, places, and connections that help us understand who we are and where we come from. A legacy worth preserving for generations yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.